country that's very rich in its social and political traditions. I grew up in a household that had no income, a single-parent household, grew up on welfare. In my later life, then benefited from active and dynamic markets that enabled me to raise capital, form businesses. And as life has gone on, I've become increasingly concerned that the benefits of what we've built in Britain as a social fabric are being put at risk. It's in that context that I've made the decision, although not the member of any party, to support the Liberal Democrats at this election. And I have a very specific word or two I'd like to address just as we get into today's event, specifically to Conservative voters who might be wondering where their obligations lie in this election also. You know, we do have a very, very rich political tradition in Britain. We're very, very fortunate people. Largely our political identities we find over time are formed through our past experiences and the way we choose to see the world and reason the world as we grow as adults. And having a variety of different political traditions has enabled Britain to have such a strong democracy for so long. If we look back at the most recently arriving political tradition, perhaps the Labour movement, here only 100 years, it arose out of the need to address industrial and now post-industrial change. And if you're somebody who in Britain has a preference for large state intervention, well, that's always been clear for you then where you wanted to vote. And indeed, in this election, you have that option also. You then go to the second oldest political tradition, the Liberal tradition. Our party, this party, the one that's been speaking to you today, is a group that has been there defending the rights of the individual, always willing to engage in difficult issues, come up with very practical policy solutions, perhaps ranging all the way from the Liberal group that formed the Beveridge Report and brought around the modern welfare state, all the way through to, if you've had the chance to examine the current Liberal Democrat manifesto, you'll see exactly that same willingness to intelligently engage with the world as it is and not how we all wish it was. And if you've been a Conservative voter in the past, it's probably because you've been drawn to the inherent uncertainty and caution with which change should occur. You may simply be one of those people for whom you'd rather see incremental change than radical change, reversible change, and you want instinctively to be conservative in the way in which things develop from here. And that's no bad thing either. All three of those rich political traditions are what allow us as a country to develop a democracy, to form a pluralistic society, and to return to Parliament a group of people that reflect broadly those instincts across the country as a whole, so they can work their way through in a measured way to what's right for the country's next step. And my simple question to you as a Conservative voter in the past is, what's your choice now? If you have, through your past instinct, been somebody who prefers large state intervention, you have a clear option at this election. If you're somebody who wants to deal with the world as it is with intelligent policy prescriptions and a proactive forward agenda rather than referring back to the nostalgia of the past, you have a Liberal Democrat option always available to you, just as you have in the past. What's your option if you are a decently moderate, instinctively cautious Conservative voter at this election? For your party is no longer available to you as a choice for your vote on the 12th of December. The apparatus of the modern Conservative Party has now fallen under the sway of a faction within it that has now committed to such a reckless path for Britain's future that a Conservative voter could never support it. A genuine Conservative voter would be instinctively cautious about a commitment to take our country out of its last 50 years of foreign policy and trading relationships without any underpin or any expectation that we would have in the future anything like the same level of trade access and the economic growth, and therefore the flow from that economic growth through to the incomes and living standards of people in Great Britain. And so a Conservative voter faces a real dilemma. If the Conservative choice is not available to you at this election, if the only thing called Conservative is in fact anything but Conservative, what do you do? It's in that context I would urge you to listen very carefully to what Joe Swinson's going to say in the next 15 or 20 minutes. For there's a very clear alternative for you. It's the alternative that's come up in the past, where regardless of your prior instinctive desire to support one group, you see that at certain moments in our history, there's a need to act practically intelligently in a different fashion. And we've seen this in the past, from elections in the past, all the way through. If you are a Conservative voter, you'll know all the way back in your own party's history to 1846 and the decision of Robert Peel to take a large group of Conservative MPs out of the Conservative Party in order to repeal the Corn Laws and defend the poor from very high prices for bread. A group that eventually, just a few years later, in 1859, formed the modern Liberal Party. So as a Conservative voter, a small c Conservative voter, it is possibly this moment again that you need to examine the Liberal Democrat option as the right thing to do in returning a parliament that can mediate the different needs of the country going forward, rather than plunge recklessly during 2020 in a vastly different direction. My final point is this. We are all, as a result of a political culture, a tiny bit sceptical when we read manifestos of all parties at all elections. We know that not everything that is put forward in a party's proposal will actually happen in office. You might read the Labour Party manifesto, and a small part of you will go, that's an interesting statement of intent. Not much of that would actually happen in office. You would be absolutely, however, in a different position when you read the Conservative Party manifesto. It's very clear. If you vote Conservative, this country will leave the European Union next year without anything like the underpin to growth and living standards that would have been necessary to mediate a sensible way forward and a commitment to retain the access to the most effective trading arrangements our country's ever had. And so I ask you again as a Conservative voter, can you take that risk after a lifetime of voting against risk? Instead, I urge you to consider the small c Conservative option of thinking about returning a solid block of Liberal Democrat MPs who in Parliament can act as a brake on rashness and reckless from any party and can themselves instead fight for what we now know to be the vast majority of people in this country who did not vote for such a reckless option as is being put forward in black and white by the Conservatives in their manifesto. In that context, and very much pointing at that direction and wanting to speak to that group of people, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jo Swinson, leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Clive, very much indeed, and thank you for being here today. In exactly 2 weeks' time, voters will be going to the polls to decide the future of our country in the most important general election in a generation. It can feel like our politics has never been more polarised. It's very easy to see the extreme opposites at play. But I also wanted to take a moment to reflect on quite how much cross-party cooperation has taken place in the last 2.5 years. The balanced Parliament, with no overall majority, quickly led to an understanding among MPs that by working together, backbench MPs could make a difference. Back when Stella Creasy proposed amendments to the Queen's speech to protect women in Northern Ireland and their rights over their own bodies, that cross-party cooperation began. And we have seen MPs from all parties and none coming together to stop Brexit. And twice we have succeeded in stopping Brexit so far this year. I've never been an overly tribal politician. I've always taken the view that people in different parties are generally trying to do what they think is right, misguided though they may be, but that in good faith it is possible to work together on issues where you agree. Andrea Leadsom is an example of a politician who I share very little in common with, but I was happy to work with her and others to better protect staff within the House of Commons from bullying and harassment by improving the way those issues were dealt with. On the issue of Scotland's place in the UK, I couldn't be further from the SNP's position. But I have found it straightforward to roll up my sleeves and work alongside MPs from the SNP in the campaign for a people's vote. I've even been known to have the odd chat with Peter Bone on the way back from the parliamentary gym to a late-night vote. And I think that spirit of understanding where other people are coming from in politics is incredibly important, because most people I meet in politics, in whatever party, are in it for the right reasons. Most people. When I go and speak to children and young people, a question I often get asked at school visits is, what qualifications do you need to be a politician? What is the path into politics? Is there a particular degree that you have to study? And my answer is always the same. The most important thing, if you want to be a politician, is to care. To genuinely care about people in your community, about issues, about what's happening across your country, across the whole world. You have to care. Everything else you can learn. You can learn how to do a media interview, to stand up and make a speech like this. You can learn how to interpret dense legislation written in that language that lawyers are so famous for. You can learn all of that. But you can't fake caring. I think it's impossible to learn. I say that, which is perhaps just as well, because I'm not sure that Boris Johnson has time for lessons on caring alongside his technology lessons. Boris Johnson only cares about Boris Johnson. And he will do whatever it takes, sacrifice whatever or whoever is needed to get what he wants. This is a man who decided which side to support in the EU referendum by game playing what would be most likely to get him the keys to number 10. His life has been about becoming Prime Minister, not out of some burning desire to make people's lives better, but out of some sense of Etonian entitlement, because it's what people like him get to do. Boris Johnson doesn't care about you and your family. Just take the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a British mother wrongfully imprisoned, a small child devastated, separated from her mum. On visits to the prison, she would sit on the floor drawing pictures with Nazanin. She even asked little Gabriella to have her 5th birthday party in that prison. And Boris Johnson couldn't even be bothered to read his brief when he was talking about that case. His words were used against Nazanin at her trial. How appalling, how shocking. This wasn't some Oxford University tutorial that you could just rock up to and blag your way through. This was giving evidence to a select committee as Foreign Secretary, and he just didn't care enough to get it right, even when the life of a British woman in prison depended on it. It's either extreme incompetence or unbelievable arrogance, and it is unforgivable. Boris Johnson doesn't really care about the future of our country, which he is willing to sell up the river just to please the extreme wing of his party and Nigel Farage. Why else would he keep a no-deal Brexit on the table? A no deal that would lead to food shortages in our supermarkets, to medicine shortages in our hospitals, to our family and friends across the country fearing for their jobs. You cannot trust a word Boris Johnson says. This man will say anything if it means getting what he wants. He lied to the 3 million people from other EU countries living in the UK when he told them that he would guarantee their right to stay. He lied when he said that no Conservative Prime Minister would ever put a border down the Irish Sea. He lied when he said over and over that we would leave the European Union by the 31st of October. He lied when he said he would be rather to be dead in a ditch than ask for an extension to Article 50. Well, there might not be a ditch, but Boris Johnson has certainly dragged the office of Prime Minister through the mud, lying to the Queen to unlawfully shut down our democracy. Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister, not just because he doesn't care, not just because he lies, but because also he is complicit in stoking division and fear in our communities. Why else would Britain's biggest racist, Tommy Robinson, be supporting him? Honestly, such an endorsement would shame any decent person. But Boris Johnson has no shame when it comes to the language he uses about race. Last April, a friend texted me. He said, "My 10-year-old daughter has just told me she doesn't want to leave the house tomorrow because of Punish a Muslim Day." I was heartbroken. No child in our country should fear for their safety when they step out of their home. Just this week, the Muslim Council of Britain accused Boris Johnson's party of denial, dismissal and deceit over Islamophobia. And despite promising an investigation into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson has failed to recognise those genuine concerns, preferring to hide behind the worst kind of whataboutery. As if the Tories' failure to treat Muslims with respect is somehow neutralised by Labour's failure to tackle anti-Semitism. They are both abhorrent. How, in 2019, can we be in this place in our country? Boris Johnson thinks it is fine to compare Muslim women to letterboxes and bank robbers. When challenged, he bumbles on about remarks being taken out of context. What doesn't he understand? There is no context in which those remarks are okay. I'm lucky. I've literally never been racially abused walking down the street. In fact, I've never been racially abused, full stop. But actually, it's not luck, is it? It's because I have white skin. I don't wear a hijab or any other outward expression of religious identity. Because I doubt that there is a person of colour in this country who has never felt the onslaught of racial abuse. Hate crimes are on the increase. The words that our political leaders use matter. When those in positions of power like Boris Johnson are so careless and cavalier, pretending it's all banter, it's a bit of a jape, we can't be surprised that others feel empowered to spread hurtful bile and worse. I remember how I felt when Trump was elected. A rich white man could boast about sexually assaulting women, telling people how you could just grab them by the pussy, and he could still be elected US president. How utterly depressing. What message did that send to girls and young women in America and right around the world? Now we have our own Britain Trump, Boris Johnson. Whether it's the sexist, patronising crap of comparing elite women athletes to wet otters, or him bragging about patting his female boss on the bottom, or when I read Charlotte Edwards' account of how he groped her at a lunchtime event. This man isn't someone our sons can look up to, that our daughters can have faith in. Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister. And a majority government led by Boris Johnson would leave us all poorer, more divided, and standing alone in the world. He would ram through his bad Brexit deal. That will result in job losses, hurt our NHS, threaten our environmental protections, weaken workers' rights, and put our family of nations under enormous strain. He will keep whatever promise he made to Nigel Farage in exchange for the Brexit Party standing down in those hundreds of seats for the Conservatives. And I dread to think what he's planning to give him. He refuses to accept that he won't be able to negotiate a trade deal with the EU in under a year. And he'll then refuse to extend that transition beyond December 2020. Before we know it, the ERG finally get their way, what they want. We effectively crash out of the EU without a deal, effectively just a little later than they would have liked. And despite all he says about getting Brexit done in a matter of weeks, we know it will just be the beginning of years and years and years of more negotiations. Passing his deal in Parliament is like watching episode 1 of a 10-season box set. The YouGov poll last night showed that Boris Johnson is on course to get a majority, that Labour are on course to suffer their second worst post-war defeat. And it's clear that only the Liberal Democrats can win significant numbers of seats from the Conservatives. We can absolutely stop Boris Johnson from getting a majority. The Liberal Democrats can stop him. In places like Richmond Park, South Cambridgeshire, Cheltenham, St Albans and Esher and Walton, we are doing everything we can to stop Boris Johnson. Because if we let him win a majority, if we let him get what he wants, then we'll have a Prime Minister who offends and frightens entire communities, who will always put his own interest ahead of the national interest, who will lie and break promises to get what he wants, who wants to take us backwards. Boris Johnson pretends to respect the long tradition of one-nation conservatism. But this is the man who kicked Ken Clarke and Churchill's grandson out of his Conservative Party. The simple truth is that moderate Conservatives are no longer welcome in Boris Johnson's Conservatives. So my message this morning is clear. If you want to stop Boris Johnson, vote Liberal Democrat. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got time for some questions from the media. So first of all, we've got Laura from Sky.
Swinson, you said that your message is clear. It doesn't seem clear, though, because your message is changed halfway through a campaign. How is that clear to voters?
Our message is absolutely consistent. The Liberal Democrats want to stop Brexit. We've been saying that loudly and clearly for the last 3.5 years, and we're going to continue to say that. And the more Liberal Democrat MPs we get elected, the more likely we will be able to make that a reality. Obviously, in any campaign, when you see a cosy stitch-up between Farage and Boris Johnson, that has an impact on how the campaign runs. And obviously, we see in the polls that were published last night the impact that that has on the potential electoral result. But it is the Liberal Democrats who are challenging the Conservatives in so many seats across the country. And that's why it's so important that we are able to get that message out there to win those seats. And I know our teams right across those constituencies are doing a fantastic job in doing so. I've got Rebecca from ITV.
You criticised Boris Johnson that his party is doing far better in the polls than your party. Is there anything you think you can learn from Boris Johnson?
Well, that's a lovely question. Boris Johnson's someone who is prepared to say whatever it takes. He's not fussed about whether what he says is what he believes or what he'll do. And maybe, you know, people can point at the polls and say that that strategy is working for him. But that's not a strategy I want to emulate, because I think it's important that I stand true to what I believe in, that our party stands true to what we believe in. And that's the kind of campaign that I want to run. And we're going to be proud of this campaign. I've got George at the FT.
Hi. You made very strong personal attack on Boris Johnson. I was just looking at the YouGov figures. He has positive ratings for decisiveness, strength and likability, whereas by contrast your own personal ratings have gone down during the course of this campaign. How do you account for that?
Well, look, clearly I am standing on a position of stopping Brexit. That's not going to be popular with everybody. And equally, I stand in a position of wanting to stop independence in Scotland and keep the UK together. And again, that's not going to be popular with everybody. I'm going to stand up for what I believe in and make that case as effectively and powerfully as I can, standing alongside my fantastic team of Liberal Democrats. And, I think that's the important test, really, to make sure I do that, rather than sort of doing some kind of focus group and then saying, well, if we change what we believe on this, then we might do a bit better over there. I think we need to be guided by what we believe in, how we want to build a better future for our country. And a better future is possible. I don't want the endorsement of people like Tommy Robinson. So that would be one vote. I certainly would not want in the Liberal Democrat column. And I would be very happy to make those things clear. And I think Boris Johnson should do similarly. So we've got Ned from HuffPo.
Lord Heseltine at a Lib Dem press conference yesterday said that your policy of revoking Article 50 was naive. Doesn't the YouGov poll last night that shows your enforcement got just one more seat prove that he's right?
Well, I mean, he's very obviously entitled to his view, and I very much welcome the fact that he's encouraging people to vote Liberal Democrat. As Liberal Democrats, we are about stopping Brexit. It's pretty obvious, and so it's not surprising that we have said that a Liberal Democrat majority government would revoke Article 50, and in every other circumstance we will continue to campaign for the people's vote that we have led the campaign for over the last 3.5 years in Parliament and around the country. So I think the fact that someone like Michael Heseltine, a former cabinet minister, effective deputy prime minister for the Conservative Party, is encouraging people to vote Liberal Democrat just speaks volumes about how far the Conservatives have departed that territory of one nation conservatism. And it's backed up by Nigel Farage standing down for the Conservatives. It is very, very clear for people that what is now on offer is a takeover of the Conservative Party by the Brexit Party. And that is something which I think many people do look at and feel that they want another way forward, and Liberal Democrats are giving people that choice. Emily from BuzzFeed.
I had a leaflet in my door this week saying Joe Swinson is the Prime Minister you deserve. Do you still think you can be Prime Minister, or is this a change of strategy to definitely stop Boris Johnson getting the majority?
Well, I would love to be Prime Minister, particularly when I see what's on offer from Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. Clearly, when you look at the polls at this stage in the campaign, that's pretty unlikely as we stand here right now. But we are in a position where we can stop Boris Johnson being Prime Minister. And that is hugely important with 2 weeks to go, that we can make sure we get that message out there. I think what the polling and the MRP shows, it's not a prediction of what's going to happen. It doesn't take into account many seat-specific circumstances, and particularly it doesn't take into account the kind of squeeze voting that happens in many constituencies. As Liberal Democrats, we are well used to campaigning under the first-past-the-post voting system, which has all of the flaws which we are well documented. But what this shows, when we are in second place first or second place in 134 seats on that current snapshot, that we really are in a position to challenge the Conservatives and to win seats from them. Not only in places where we have previously been in close contests with the Conservatives, but also in places where they have been, pretty heartland Tory seats. Places like Finchley and Golders Green, which, let's face it, was Margaret Thatcher's old constituency. Places like Esher and Walton, where the Foreign Secretary is obviously under attack from the Liberal Democrats, and where Lib Dems, could pull off a moment that I think everybody would want to stay up for. Peter from The Guardian.
Hi. Yeah. Joe, Boris Johnson has refused repeatedly to talk about his personal life, which is obviously his choice. But the public is being asked to re-elect a PM when they don't know even some basic biographical details about him. For example, the number of children he has and why he refuses to say.
I have 2 children, by the way. Very. And I think I would have noticed, I really did notice both times.
Do you think this is a strange position for the country to be in?
I mean, look, everybody makes their own decisions about, where they draw that line in terms of family life, and I think that is an important line that, the people who we love, who are families, are able to have some privacy. I think that is hugely important. To be honest, what was really troubling for me was to see that he didn't seem to know the wheels of the bus. And the wheels of the bus. I mean, I just was like, how can you have any child and not know the wheels in the bus? In fact, I think most people that, are not parents themselves know the words to the wheels in the bus. And also, do you know what? It's not that difficult to pick it up after the first line as well. So for me, that was a moment in the campaign that I did. Well, it's not like I was a floating voter anyway, to be fair. But he would have definitely lost me at that point. Thank you very much to everybody, to Liberal Democrats and members of the media. I really appreciate having had the opportunity to set out my thoughts on this today. And to the Lib Dems, keep campaigning. Thank you.